So while we're waiting for the mash in, I figured I would chat with you about homebrewing and sort of your life in homebrewing.
Sure.
So what we're drinking here before we get into is not a homebrew. This is the Nickelbrook Uber Berliner Weiss, but this has been aged for a year. So it's a sour German wheat beer. What are your thoughts on this one?
It's really nice. It's got a lot of a nice lacto note to it. It's tart, but it's not overly tart. But it's nice and dry.
Yeah, it's got that dry finish to it.
Very refreshing. It's a great summer beer, actually.
That's what we figured. Hot day, you're standing around a hot kettle, may as well have a nice cold beer.
Yeah.
So the first thing I want to ask is, when people say, I homebrew or I'm really into homebrewing, what exactly does that mean? Is there sort of a general definition of homebrewing, or do you think that there's sort of a lot of different definitions within that?
I think there are a lot of different definitions because certain people get into it and have differing levels of involvement and equipment and time that they spend.
Right.
So you can just be a casual brewer that takes a 1 gallon batch and just brews it on a stove top and makes 10 bottles of beer basically. Or you can be really fancy with a nice big system that has a recirculating pump, and you can spend a lot of money. This can be a very expensive hobby,
Right.
but it's really up to you. At the end of the day, everybody's doing the same thing. You're just making beer.
Yeah.
So
And so for you, why did you get into homebrewing? What was it that sort of first appealed to you?
originally, I was just really interested in learning more about beer. I had all these big dreams of opening my own brewery, and I figured, you know what, if I'm going to open a brewery, I should probably learn a thing or two about brewing. And when I started doing that, that's when I realized I had a lot to learn. You can't
Right.
just start home brewing and say, I'm going to open a brewery just like that. It just doesn't work that way.
So I've noticed that a lot of the breweries that are opening, at least in Toronto, recently seem to be stemming up from guys that did homebrew or started in homebrew.
Yeah.
Reinhard, Halo, Folly to an extent. A lot of these guys are homebrewers that are now going big. Do you think that it's really important for anybody to start a brewery to be able to homebrew? Is that a prerequisite for you?
I think so, but it's not necessary. I mean, there are people going through college programs like Niagara College and the Siebel Institute, those kind of things, where they learn how to brew, they learn their craft. But at the end of the day, no matter how much knowledge you have, you still need experience.
Right.
And as a home brewer, the more times you brew, the more experience you have, because you're going to make mistakes when you brew. Best way to do them is on a small scale. Learn how to brew before you start brewing, on a larger scale.
Right.
Now, I've actually heard arguments to the contrary from people like the brewers at Bellwoods. Actually, they say that home brewing is nothing at all like brewing on a big system. And if you're going to learn how to brew, you should learn how to brew on a big system.
So what would be the big differences between, other than size, doing a 5 gallon versus a 20 hectoliter batch? What would be the big differences, you think?
Well, not to get too technical, but mash efficiency and hop utilization, like basically how bitter your beer is going to be, because the amount of hops you use in a home brew is going to be different than what you use on a large scale brew. So tweaking that, like you can't just take a homebrew batch and multiply it by 200 to make a big batch. It doesn't
Right.
work that way.
Right.
You actually have to scale things up rather scientifically in order to get the same flavor profile, the same bitterness, all of those things.
Okay. So have you found that some guy, and we don't have to mention names, but have you found going to some of these breweries now or trying breweries in the past that started as homebrewers and are now professionals, have you found that those issues are popping up, or are you finding that they're generally able to scale up pretty well?
I think they've all managed to scale up pretty well because I didn't actually taste their homebrew. So
Right. Maybe they're just really amazing homebrewers to start.
they could have been. Well, actually, that's not true. I have tasted homebrew. Friend of mine, Brad Clifford.
Yep.
He started as an award-winning homebrewer, and now he contract brews
Cool.
at Cool. And quite honestly, his porter tasted the same as homebrew as it does professionally.
And it's fantastic. Yeah.
So there's a good example of someone who's been able to take a homebrew recipe and scale it up successfully.
Right.
So it's not that it's impossible. It's just very difficult.
Right. And so that's probably a big stumbling block that a lot of people will encounter as they transition from homebrew to professional.
Yeah, and
that
there's
scaling.
there's a lot more to deal with on a brewery side, like supplies. You can't just run down to your homebrew supply shop, get what you need for your next brew. You have to, in some cases, order your hops years ahead of time.
Yeah.
Because there's a shortage of hops on a larger scale.
And you need a lot more.
You need a lot more.
You can't just buy a little package.
No.
Yeah. So speaking of a homebrew supply shop, if I want to get into homebrew, or someone who's never done homebrew wants to get into it, what's sort of the startup cost generally? Because you mentioned there is a scale of
Yeah.
cost.
My recommendation for anybody who wants to start is start small, and you can pick up one of those Brooklyn brew shop kits. I can't
Yeah, Brooklyn Brew House or
brew
Brooklyn
whatever
yeah.
they're called, but it's a 1 gallon kit, and they give you the grains already ground up, the hops already measured out, the yeast, everything you need. They give you a 1 gallon carboy, but it's basically a 1 gallon jug
Yeah.
and an airlock, and all you need are pots and pans in your that you would normally have in your kitchen.
Yeah.
So you can, and they give you instructions on how to brew it, and that is brewing on a small scale. And when you do that, you figure out whether or not you actually like the process. You can figure out whether or not you're good at it, because if you're good at it, you'll soon find that your beers. I joke about a 1 gallon batch being, if the beer is bad, it's only 1 gallon. You can pour it out. It's essentially 10 bottles.
Yeah.
But if it's good, it's only 10 bottles,
then
and you got to brew it
and then
again.
you want to brew it again.
And that's when people start to scale up and start to experiment. That's the other thing about 1 gallon brewing. You can make a jalapeno saison, or a chocolate peanut butter cookie, whatever.
Right.
You can experiment without being worried that you have 48 bottles of something god awful in your fridge that you have to get through.
So, have you found that homebrewing is growing in popularity over the last
I would
5
say
years?
so, and I think Facebook has a lot to do with the success. In the past, I remember when I first got into homebrewing, there were bulletin boards and discussion groups, and it was quite difficult to get any kind of really good advice, because it would take a while for someone to answer your question. Whereas GTA Brews, which is a big homebrew club in Toronto, has something like 1,200 members. And if you go and ask a question on their Facebook page, you'll probably within 2 minutes get 5 or 6 people answering your question.
Right.
And some of them will agree or disagree with each other, but at least you get a bunch of different pieces of advice that are, I find, infinitely helpful.
And I don't mean this to be offensive, but can something that's brewed at home ever compare or compete or be as good as something that's brewed on, say, a professional scale?
I would give that a resounding absolutely yes.
Okay.
There are festivals that devote themselves to this kind of thing. Cask Days is one of them. Cask Days is all about small batch brews. I do something called the People's Pint, where we bring together amateurs and professionals who will do small batch brews. And it's almost like the whole 1 gallon brewing. You can experiment, you can do kind of cool things that you wouldn't normally do on a large system. So you can get really creative when you're doing, say, a 5 gallon brew or a 10 gallon brew, because it's not a lot of beer. You're not gonna, and professionals love to do this kind of stuff. They love to experiment, and then in the case of something like Cask Days or People's Pint, is that they can serve it to the public and get feedback. And if there's enough positive feedback, then they'll scale it up and they'll make that a commercial brew.
Right. So, excuse me. There you go. So what, other than, start small, is there anything that you learned sort of in your first, say, 10 batches or 20 batches that you wish you had known before starting brewing that you would?
You know what? I still learn. I'll learn something new every single time I brew. Sometimes it's just a little thing. Like an example would be the body of the brew is dependent on your mash temperature. A few degrees will leave a few unfermentable sugars, whereas a lower temperature mash will make a lot more fermentable sugars, so you have a lighter bodied beer. So, but I didn't get that until I'd brewed a few times, and sometimes just made a mistake. I brewed at a higher mash temperature than I had anticipated, and then when the beer was finished, it was fuller bodied. I'm like, oh, that's what that did.
Yeah.
So that kind of stuff happens regularly, and usually mistakes, most often, are happy mistakes rather than got to dump this batch kind of mistakes, which does happen from time to time,
For sure.
especially when you're pushing the envelope. A good example of that is I made a white stout, which
Okay.
sounds kind of weird.
Yep.
It's basically a golden colored beer that tastes like a stout.
So how do you do that?
Well,
I don't want to give the secrets away.
no, it's fine. So what you do is you take the batch and you put in whole like after it's brewed,
Yeah.
post fermentation, you add whole coffee beans
Okay.
and cocoa nibs.
Oh, okay.
And in my case, I took half the batch and I put it in a bourbon barrel, seasoned it with
Where did you get a bourbon barrel?
I have a small 5 liter or 10 liter bourbon barrel
So
from Toronto Distilling.
So these are the things that, like, as a home brewer, you can start acquiring this cool, like,
Yeah.
little tools and barrels and fun things, and really
I bought
experimenting.
I bought the barrel from a homebrew shop. So now here's where it went wrong is that the barrel aged part, I split the batch in half.
Yeah.
The barrel aged part was fantastic. Tasted great. And then I went to blend it with the part that had the coffee and the cocoa in it. I left it in there too long. And so it was really, really astringent.
Gotcha.
It had pulled out all the bitterness from the coffee and completely ruined that half. And I thought that mixing them together would kind of bring that down, but it didn't. It was just way too strong.
Right.
So, and then I thought, okay, I'll carbonate this, I'll bottle condition it, and I'll let it sit and see if it mellows out. Never did.
No, nice.
So, but when you're pushing the envelope on styles and doing something kind of creative, sometimes things don't always work.
Yeah. So my last question is, what do you think is the best part about homebrewing? What's your favorite thing about it?
Drinking it
All right.
and sharing it. That's probably, for me,
Yeah.
is probably the most gratifying part of brewing, is sharing it with someone and telling me they like it.
Yeah.
Saying, can I have another one? That's the best part.
Awesome. Well, I think we are almost in our mash here based on the timer, so let's get back to brewing.
Sounds good.
Cheers.
Cheers.